fills in and helps us to understand what's going on. Welcome to this course through the Logos software system. I'm Darrell Bock, Senior Research Professor of New Testament Studies at Dallas Theological Seminary, as well as Executive Director for Cultural Engagement for the Howard G. Hendricks Center for Christian Leadership and Cultural Engagement at the seminary. And I grew up learning my theology first, interestingly enough, at the University of Texas at Austin, where I was a history major. Actually, they didn't teach me any theology at all. It was a state university. But from there, I went to Dallas Theological Seminary, where I got a master's degree in theology, and from there went on to spend 3 years doing doctoral work at the University of Aberdeen in Scotland. I've also spent 4 years on different sabbaticals, 4 single years in Tübingen University, the University of Tübingen in Germany, which is where I have done almost all my postdoctoral work. And so with that background, I bring hopefully some expertise to help to discuss various issues in the New Testament, which is what this course is about. We're going to give you some discussion of the background of the New Testament and how background fills in and helps us to understand what's going on in the text. We're going to take a look at the Gospels and how they work and how they're structured and why we have 4 of them. We're also going to look at all those other Gospels that you hear about and why they don't become a part of Scripture, why they're not in the Bible. We're going to consider the resurrection, a central event of the New Testament, and take a look at detail about how those accounts work together to present who it is that Jesus is and what it is that he's done. And then finally, we're going to take a look at the early church, the way in which it ministered after Jesus' death and resurrection, and how the Spirit of God empowered the early community to be effective in the taking of the gospel message out into the world and to be a missional church. So I invite you in for the journey, and we trust that your study and the time and the discussions that we lead into will be something that will encourage you in your own study of the Scripture. Welcome to Background of the New Testament. It is important to understand the nature of backgrounds when it comes to the study of New Testament, and oftentimes backgrounds are underappreciated. And I thought I would start off the course by talking about how background works. The phrase I like to use for backgrounds is cultural scripts. Cultural scripts are things that the reader and the writer share because they share the culture, which means a lot doesn't have to be explained in order for them to get it. For example, if I were to use the sentence, "The cowboys are going up to the frozen tundra to melt the cheeseheads," you would know immediately I'm talking about American football if you lived in the United States. But if someone in Saudi Arabia was learning English as a second language and they picked up a lexicon that was English-Arabic, they could translate every one of those words and have no idea that American football was being talked about. And notice that American football wasn't even in that sentence. You know immediately what the topic is by the nature of the material because you connect to the code words that help open up the background. Cowboys, frozen tundra, cheeseheads. Now, if I change that sentence and I say, Ian Botham marched to the crease to defend the ashes on behalf of His Majesty, that would probably give you pause, at least if you live in the United States, because you're not a cricket fan. If you understood British cricket, then you would understand that sentence as well. Well, the Bible is loaded with cultural scripts that are informed by the background that contributes to them. And the more you understand the cultural scripts and the culture of the New Testament, the more you'll understand what's going on with the passages. So we're going to be introducing you to a lot of events and backgrounds that contribute to the understanding of the New Testament and why the New Testament focuses on the kinds of issues that it does in the way that it does. Because the religious world of the first century was not quite the religious world of our time. And so it's important to understand the cultural scripts in order to understand what's going on in the text. As we think about backgrounds of the New Testament, we cannot talk about the New Testament without thinking about Second Temple Judaism. And Second Temple Judaism was a peculiar religion in the ancient world. It had a lot of unusual practices that were seen as signs of faithfulness for those who practiced the law and the prophets and the Psalms, practiced Judaism. And there are really 5 features that make Judaism unique. The first, of course, was its monotheism. There was a belief in one God and one God only. In contrast to the Greco-Roman world, where there were gods all around, Judaism held to one God alone. In fact, if you walk into Pompeii today and you take a tour of that city which has been preserved for us from the first century, you will see numerous temples to various gods as you walk in the marketplace or the agora area. And if you walk out from the agora area, you will also see more temples to more gods. But Israel had one God only. And so this monotheistic faith drove them to react to the Gentiles who were all around them. Second feature that made the faith of Jews unique was the single temple, which of course reflected the belief in the one God. We have one temple because we have one God. We don't have many temples because there are many gods. And this single temple was another feature that made Judaism unique. And the belief was that God dwelled in this temple, in the Holy of Holies, in what was called the Shekinah, which was the most sacred spot on earth as far as a Jewish person was concerned. And of course, this temple was located in Jerusalem. The third feature that made Judaism unique was its special calendar and its special days. Actually, one day in particular was special, and that was the Sabbath. One day a week, people would pause to take a look at and reflect upon God and what he was doing. And this special day was unlike the rest of religious faith around them in that one day was concentrated and dedicated to not working and spending time with God. Another feature that was unique to the Jews and that got a lot of criticism and flack from the Greco-Roman world around it was the practice of circumcision, that males would be circumcised as a sign of the covenant to show their commitment to God. This was another very unique feature of Second Temple Judaism, and those outside the faith saw it as a very cruel act and something wasn't supposed to be, wasn't worth imitating or even thinking about imitating. It was just too painful to think about. And then last but not least, we have diet, a special diet, what we call kosher today, that Jews kept to show their faithfulness to God and to distinguish clean from unclean foods as a way of showing the peculiarities of the way God has ordered the creation. So these features made Second Temple Judaism unique from the world around it, the religious world around it. And what's really important to appreciate about that is that when Gentiles had these other practices, Jews, in order to affirm their faithfulness to their God, would engage in these practices that were distinctive to mark them out as distinct. The first key event and figure that impacts the New Testament actually takes place centuries before the time of the New Testament. It is the figure of Alexander the Great. He is a dominant figure of this period and a dominant figure of classical history because of the amount of territory that came under his authority as he was ruling. He was the son of Philip of Macedon, and as he expanded the Macedonian Empire and acquired more and more territory, his influence grew. He didn't live very long. He only lived into his 30s. He was born in 356 BC and became king in 336 BC. But by the time he died, just slightly more than a decade later, he had conquered territory extending all the way from Egypt over to India. And that influence was huge. A review of his life and his key conquests will show how quickly this expansion took place. And remember, we're in a time in which we do all this by foot and by elephants and by horses and not by planes. He became king in 336 BC. He attacked Persia and Granicus in 334. And a look at the map will help you to see where these locations are. Syria and Palestine were next in 332 and 331, and his influence over Israel was important. Josephus, the first century Jewish historian, even talks about his visit to Jerusalem. As we continue on and thinking about where he where his power found itself. He re-entered Persia and took very much control of that area, which had been the dominating empire in the region up to that point, in 331. He reached India by 326, and he died in 323. His soldiers were not comfortable with all the conquests because it took a lot of work to conquer all this land and the speed with which Alexander the Great did it. And they started to rebel against him as he was on his way back and making a stop on the way home back to Macedonia. He became ill and passed away suddenly. He died in 323. He only ruled for 13 years, but he conquered all this territory in the meantime. He lived only to his early 30s. Really an amazing story and an amazing figure. But the reason he's important for the New Testament is that he unified a culture under the influence of the Greco-Roman world. And the phrase Greco-Roman that feeds into the New Testament backgrounds, the Greco part of that influence, is really the legacy of Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great emphasized Greek culture. He lifted it up and he tried to unify the world under this culture. And with it came a polytheism and all the practices associated with polytheism that threatened Jews in terms of their own particular religious faith and their distinctives of their religious faith. This put terrific pressure on Judaism, and it was something that made them very uncomfortable with a Gentile presence, particularly a Gentile presence in their own land that would surround them and put pressure on them as the influence of Hellenization impacted itself on Israel. As we noted, Alexander left a terrific imprint on the ancient world. It was an imprint that lasted for several centuries, including the time of the New Testament. And the major feature of that imprint is the idea of Hellenization. Hellenization was the moving the world in the direction of Greco-Roman culture and of Greek practices in particular. Influences of such figures as Plato and Socrates and other great Greek philosophers formed the way in which politics was pursued and also influenced the way in which cultures were structured. And Alexander left this imprint and passed it on, and even though when he died his kingdom was divided, the influence of the pressure of Hellenization remained across the extant world of that period, and particularly creeped into Israel, where the Jewish faith and the Jewish nation was put under pressure. Nothing shows this as vividly as the book of First Maccabees. This is a work which is often associated with what is called the Old Testament Apocrypha, but it still has value as a historical work in illuminating the background that feeds into the New Testament, because it gives us a glimpse at the attitudes certain Jews had towards the influx of Hellenization. And rather than my talking about this, I think the words of the ancient texts themselves express themselves very clearly about what was felt about Hellenism. So we're going to take a quick look at 1 Maccabees chapter 1 and some events described in chapter 2 to get a feel for what's going on here. So 1 Maccabees 1:1-5 reads as follows. After Alexander, son of Philip the Macedonian, who came from the land of Kittim, had defeated King Darius of the Persians and the Medes, he succeeded him as king. He had previously become king of Greece. He fought many battles, conquered strongholds, and put to death the kings of the earth. He advanced to the ends of the earth and plundered many nations. When the earth became quiet before him, he was exalted, and his heart was lifted up. He gathered a very strong army and ruled over countries and nations and princes, and they became tributary to him. After this, he fell sick and perceived that he was dying. And so first, the book of Maccabees begins by telling us the story of Alexander the Great, the king, as he expands his power by conquering various nations. But it's not just the presence of power that is threatening, it's what the presence of that power represents. And so we read on a few verses later in 1 Maccabees 10-15. From them came forth a sinful root, Antiochus Epiphanes, the son of King Antiochus. We've now moved from the 320s, if you will, now to about the 160s BC. It says, he came forth from a sinful root, Antiochus Epiphanes, son of King Antiochus. He had been a hostage in Rome. He began to reign in the 137th year of the kingdom of the Greeks. So powerful was the influence of Alexander the Great that the calendar was dated by how long the kingdom he had established and had set up had been present. And so Antiochus Epiphanes appears in the 137th year of the kingdom of the Greeks that Alexander the Great started. In those days, certain renegades came out from Israel and misled many, saying, let us go and make a covenant with the Gentiles around us, for since we separated from them, many disasters have come upon us. This proposal pleased them, and some of the people eagerly went to the king, who authorized them to observe the ordinances of the Gentiles. So they built a gymnasium in Jerusalem according to Gentile custom and removed the marks of circumcision and abandoned the holy covenant. They joined with the Gentiles and sold themselves to do evil. This last set of verses in 1 Maccabees chapter 1 that we read, verses 12-14, shows the threat. And the threat is that covenant has been abandoned, that is the Jewish covenant. The law has been abandoned as certain people decide to follow the practices of the Gentiles, and the cultural influence comes into Judaism, and some people are comfortable with this and are willing to compromise their faith in order to engage in these practices. On the other hand, the writer of 1 Maccabees is alarmed. He is alarmed at the fact that Jews would choose to take up Gentile practices, that they would leave the law behind, that they would go to the gymnasium, which would be a place where they would exercise in the nude, something that would be offensive to Jews, that they would, as a result, remove the marks of circumcision, the sign of the distinctiveness of who the Jewish people were, that was the sign of the covenant that every male was to perform in Judaism. That distinction was left behind, as well as many other practices. And so the text says that they went on to do evil, clearly not an acceptance of what was going on, and clearly seeing the incursion of Gentile influence as a threat to Jewish practice. When we consider the various responses to the arrival of Hellenism on Israel's political and social map, what we see are a variety of reactions that produce different groups that respond to this. And so the groupings that we see in the New Testament, or that we see around the New Testament in some cases, are the result of different reactions to the presence of Hellenism in Israel's life and culture. For example, there are the Sadducees. The Sadducees basically accept that Hellenism is present. They welcome some of the aspects of Greco-Roman culture. They cooperate with the Gentile rulers who they come in contact with in Israel, and they emerge as the people who are trying to make the best of a bad situation by simply assimilating to it. In contrast to that, we have the Pharisees, who emerge in the period of Antiochus Epiphanes, and they emerge by engaging the culture. They have their own view of the way things work. They have their own way of doing things in terms of Judaism, and they engage with that and try and push back to limit the amount of influence that takes place that's coming from the Hellenistic culture. We have others who feel so pressured by the influx of the culture that they withdraw. They withdraw into the desert, into Qumran and the Qumran community. The Dead Sea Scrolls, so famous, come from a group we think are made up of Essenes, who are ascetic Jews and strict practicers of the law. And they feel so limited by what the Hellenistic culture does to them that they move out into the desert and create their own community and their own world in which the influence of Hellenism can be seemingly minimized. Then last but not least, we have those who fight against the presence of the Greek culture and want to eliminate the presence of Gentiles in the world of which they are a part. And those become the Zealots, a group that emerges officially with that name in the 60s and 70s and leads to a war that Israel eventually has with Rome that leads to the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. So these are the four key reactions that we see. You can accept the culture like the Sadducees do. You can engage the culture like the Pharisees do. You can withdraw from the culture like the Essenes do, or you can fight the influence of Hellenization like the Zealots sought to do, even though they had no chance of removing a power like Rome at the time of the New Testament when they tried to eject the foreigners, if you will, from their land. The last thing that you see that is an adjustment to culture is the presence of the Septuagint, translating the Hebrew scriptures into the Greek language so that people can understand what the law is outside those who speak Hebrew and the emerging important language Aramaic, another Semitic cousin to Hebrew, which is what Jews spoke, but of course wasn't what Gentiles spoke. As Jews were dispersed through the presence of Hellenism in their land across from Egypt to Babylon, and as they lost contact with the Semitic language in Hebrew, they came to adopt the language of the Greeks and adopt Greek. And so even the sacred scriptures had to be translated into Greek in order for Jews to appreciate what was going on in what had been, up to that time, the Hebrew scriptures. And by doing so, it represented a picture of the cultural shift that was going on. So the Septuagint is an evidence of the nature of this influence. The Septuagint started to be translated about 250 BC or so, and that process of translation took several decades until it was completed, probably well over 100 years later. But it shows the influence of the culture on the Jewish people. So we see here the various responses to Hellenism, and we see out of those responses the very groups that we meet in the New Testament, the Sadducees and the Pharisees in particular. Two very different parties, two actually conflicting parties within Judaism. But then when Jesus comes on the scene, they will unite in reaction and in response to him. And so Hellenism is an important first event and first story that incorporates and that encompasses a key part of the background to the New Testament. The second key part of backgrounds to the New Testament beyond Alexander the Great is the story that circulates around the temple. The temple is the central part of this story, what I'm calling the temple story, because the temple was desecrated in the centuries just before the time of the New Testament by Antiochus Epiphanes, a ruler from Syria who was a Hellenist and tried to assert Syria's power over Israel. It was a power that he had to assert because the pressure of Rome on his own empire and in war that the Syrians had lost had required the payment of terrific amount of reparations from Syria to Rome. So the ruler had to find different means of raising revenue to pay off the reparations that Syria owed to Rome. One of the ways to do this was to really steal the resources of the temple and the money that had been gathered there. And that, along with the desire to unify the cultures of the nations that Syria ruled over, that is, under a Hellenistic umbrella, put pressure on Judaism, all to the point where Antiochus really tried to completely remove the Jewish distinctives that resulted in a war known as the Maccabean War. This war fought from 167 to 164 BC, although the cleanup after the war lasted as far as 142 BC. This war really explains why Judaism is the way that it is at the time of the New Testament, why there's so many people who are committed to being faithful to the law in the New Testament, and what piety and faith and faithfulness did in leading towards that emphasis on the law and the role of the law. Because in the face of a foreign culture, the way in which you assert your identity and assert your beliefs, your religious beliefs, is to remain committed to the religious principles that mark you out as distinct. And that's what happened in Judaism in this time. So the Maccabean War led to the threat of distinction. And out of that battle, with that war, there was a terrific impact on Jewish identity. During this time as well, the temple was overrun, the Holy of Holies was ransacked, pagan sacrifices were offered at the temple. These were things that shocked the Judaism at the time, and the reaction in trying to regain the temple is what the Maccabean War is all about. Again, rather than my telling you about this, I think the best way to see what the reaction was of people at the time, at least pious Jews, is to read some of the ancient texts that tell us what was going on. And so again, we're back in 1 Maccabees. We're in 1 Maccabees chapter 1, and we pick up the story with Antiochus Epiphanes in verse 20. It says, after subduing Egypt, Antiochus returned in the 143rd year. He went up against Israel and came to Jerusalem with a strong force. He arrogantly entered the sanctuary and took the golden altar, the lampstand for the light, all its utensils. He took also the table for the bread of the presence, the cups for drink offerings, the bowls, the golden censers, the curtains, the crowns, the gold decoration on the front of the temple. He stripped it all off. He took the silver and the gold and the costly vessels, and he took also the hidden treasures that he found. So Antiochus is looting the temple, and he is looting the temple for the gold and silver that can be turned into monetary resources and funds that he can send back then not only to his own pocket, but also to pay these high reparations that he owed Rome because his ancestors had lost a battle to the Romans and had been required to pay this amount of money. We read on in 1 Maccabees because it tells the reaction of how they felt about the fact that these things were going on. In 124 to 126, it says, taking them all, he went into his own land. He shed much blood and spoke with great arrogance. Israel mourned deeply in every community. Rulers and elders groaned. Young women and young men became faint. The beauty of women faded. It was a tough time, and the text is indicating that by the way it describes the reaction of the people as to what was happening during the Maccabean War. The Maccabean War left an imprint on the Jewish soul and on the Jewish psyche that really feeds into what we see in the New Testament. Reading on a little further in 1 Maccabees 1, the story continues. Then the king wrote to his whole kingdom that all should be one people. That's 1 Maccabees 1:41. And that all should give up their particular customs. All the Gentiles accepted the command of the king. Many even from Israel gladly adopted his religion. They sacrificed to idols and profaned the Sabbath. This would have been turning your back on the historic faith of Judaism and the historic commands of the Torah. And this was an affront and an offense to pious Jews. And you can almost see the tone coming out in the way the text describes the events that are being portrayed. 1 Maccabees 1:44-50 completes the story, and it reads as follows. And the king sent letters by messengers to Jerusalem and the towns of Judah. He directed them to follow customs strange to the land, to forbid burnt offerings, sacrifices, and drink offerings in the sanctuary, to profane Sabbaths and festivals, those are the special days that we were talking about, to defile the sanctuary and the priests, that's the single temple that we've been talking about, to build altars and sacred precincts and shrines for idols, that's the polytheism that runs against the monotheism that we've talked about, to sacrifice swine. Swine, of course, were one of the unclean animals that was part of the special diet that Jews followed by not eating swine, and other unclean animals, and to leave their sons uncircumcised. Circumcision, the sign of the covenant, another important distinctive of Judaism that we talked about. So all the major distinctives of Judaism are coming under attack by this edict that the king is saying Jews can no longer perform. They were to make themselves abominable. It's clear that the author of 1 Maccabees dislikes what's being asked for here. They were to make themselves abominable by everything unclean and profane, so that they would forget the law and change all the ordinances. And he added, whoever does not obey the command of the king shall die. So even to the threat of one's life, one was required to renounce all the distinctives of Jewish faith that the law had prescribed. And this caused pious Jews to be shocked. This is why they went to war. This is why they fought to regain the temple. But more important almost than regaining the temple was a fight to regain their identity and to regain their right to practice their religious faith in the face of an effort to make it extinct. It's hard to overemphasize the impact of the Maccabean War and the story of the temple for the identity of Judaism and how that influences the New Testament. There's no way to treat this as a small event. It's a huge event casting a huge shadow over the psyche of Judaism, a shadow that really is cast across several centuries, not just decades. And in fact, its influence never really leaves Judaism, even after the time of the New Testament, in the development of what became Rabbinic Judaism. The memory of this event continues to cast itself in a way that one should never forget that there was a time in which Gentiles attempted to literally wipe Judaism off the face of the earth. An influence that might be paralleled today by the way in which the Holocaust is remembered by Jews as a traumatic event in modern history of Judaism. That's what the Maccabean War was for the Judaism of its time. And so when we think about what this actually represented and its impact on Jewish identity, we see the threat of the extinction of Israel literally present in the attempt to wipe out all the distinctive practices of the Jewish faith by Antiochus Epiphanes. And this produced a huge pushback by the nation to reclaim her faithfulness to the law and her right to practice her religious faith. What we see in reaction also is the pursuit of a faithfulness through the keeping of the law. We see the law becoming important as a sign of a distinctive of what it meant to be a Jew, particularly what it meant to be a Jew in the face of a Gentile presence that was trying to wipe out the Jewish right to be distinctive. And so in the pursuit of this faithfulness, there became an attachment to keeping the law and to reflecting the law that would be a reflection of piety, be a reflection of a commitment to God, be a reflection of covenantal faithfulness. And so piety is seeking to preserve its identity, to maintain a sense of who the Jewish people are as Jewish people. And this influence really keeps itself as the driving force behind the reaction to the attempt to wipe out Judaism. The destruction of the temple in this context produces as well a fear of the influence of Gentiles. This is what the presence of the Gentiles mean to Israel. They threaten to extinguish Israel if we do not remain distinct. It produces a model for the Antichrist, the one who marches into the temple, desecrates God, and asks God's people to do that which is opposite of what God requires. Antiochus Epiphanes becomes the model in Scripture for what the world will do when it's allowed to encroach on the practices that God has commanded. And he becomes the prototype figure for what becomes the Antichrist in the New Testament. The victory of the Jewish people leads to the reestablishment of the temple as a sacred place, and it produced new hope for Israel. The hope had been that maybe now the ruling family, a dynasty within Israel, the Hasmoneans, might bring the golden age and might restore Israel to faithfulness and truth. It didn't work out that way, and it took only about 100 years for that hope to collapse. But that was the hope coming out of the victory of the Maccabean War. The hope was we had resisted, we had shown ourselves faithful to the law, we now have a king who is a Jew who rules us. Maybe now is the time when God will act on our behalf and bring total peace. But it didn't happen. The third key event before we get to the New Testament is the involvement of the Romans in the Holy Land, the Romans in Israel. We are now on the other side of the Hasmonean rule, and even though during the period of the Hasmoneans for a time there was an expansion of territory that rivaled the reach of the empire under Solomon, it eventually imploded. So much so that by the time we get to the 60s BC, brothers are fighting against one another for control of the dynasty. And eventually, both sides invite Rome into Jerusalem in one way or another to help stem the tide of what's going on. So the Romans didn't conquer Israel by force so much as they did by ineptitude and by almost a civil war situation that emerged. They did eventually have to lay siege to Jerusalem to take it in 63 when Pompey, the Roman general at the time, took over Jerusalem. But he did so at the invitation of some of the Jews who wanted the Romans to help bring peace and stability to the region that was beginning to fall apart. What we see then in the Romans' invasion of Jerusalem in Judea in 63 AD is the failure of the Hasmonean dynasty, the failure of the community, the Jewish community, to take care of itself politically through its own political rule. Actually, things started out badly for the Hasmoneans because when the Hasmoneans came into power, the priesthood and the kingship were united in one figure, something that the law did not permit. And this was controversial at the beginning point of the Hasmonean rule and got the Hasmoneans off on a bad foot in their rule. That was so disturbing that the Essenes withdrew to Qumran to separate themselves from the Hasmonean dynasty and to live in their own context, because the hope that the Hasmoneans had given of restoring the law and of doing things according to the law seemed to have fallen apart by this combination of the high priesthood and kingship in one office. Because in the Old Testament, the priestly role was given to one figure and the kingship was given to another to divide the power rather than to unite it. The excuse that the Hasmoneans gave for doing this was that they would do so temporarily until a prophet should arise that would lead to the delivering time of God on behalf of Israel in front of all the nations. When that happened, the idea was they would separate the responsibility. But some believed it would never happen, and so they rejected that idea. So from that bad start, that misstep, if you will, even though the Hasmoneans did rule for a time, by the time we get to the 60s, we have brothers fighting with one another over who will control the dynasty, and the Romans are invited in. So It is Maccabean failure that led to the Romans, to the Gentiles, reappearing in a significant way in the life of Israel. This is in 63 BC, so this is several decades before Jesus is born. As I mentioned, they were invited into the temple to take control, and we're going to look in a second at a very important text, the Psalms of Solomon 17 and 18, expressing an intense messianic hope that emerges because Rome is now in the land. And the desire is that the Gentiles who have now taken over Israel would be removed from the region. This hope fuels the desire for a messianic deliverance and fuels the hope that maybe Israel can be freed from the constraints of Gentile presence. And this attitude also feeds into the New Testament period with the messianic expectation that means that Jesus has to be careful about how he talks about messiahship as he presents who he is. The intensification of the Roman presence is seen in the presence of taxes in AD 6. As Rome takes a census and begins to collect taxes, it is obvious now that Rome is in control of the land. This also produced a spate of reaction against the Romans, some efforts at rebellion, that kind of thing, as a way of freeing one from what was perceived to be growing Roman presence and influence. These efforts also failed, but they showed the tension of what the Romans being in the land meant. And so when Jesus comes on the scene and there's a hope for kingship, this kingship is often fueled with the desire and the hope that Rome will be removed as being over Israel. When Jesus comes on the scene and claims his messiahship, however, begins to show that he is the one in whom God's hope resides. What Jesus does is to show that the battle is not a political battle with Rome, but rather that the battle is a larger battle with Satan and with spiritual forces, with forces that oppress humanity, not in a social way so much, although it manifests itself sometimes socially, but ultimately from the human heart itself. And this is Jesus' twist on the background and against the background in which he finds himself. And so he has to negotiate the presentation of who he is and what he's doing very, very carefully to deal with this intense expectation and hope that one day the people will be delivered by a Messiah, and that Messiah will kick out the Romans, and Israel will be free from this Gentile pressure that she has had to live with now for several centuries. The Roman takeover of Israel was very traumatic for the nation, and it led to the production of a text that expressed the hope that one day Israel would be able to free itself from the yoke of Roman presence. This was done symbolically in a picture, in a text that has probably the most famous messianic military text of Jewish hope that we have from the Second Temple period in a work called the Psalms of Solomon. We think the Psalms of Solomon was written sometime after Pompey took over Jerusalem in 63 BC. And so we're going to look at this text because, again, I think the words of the ancients help to express the background more powerfully than I can do it by just simply telling you the story. Let's hear the story of the ancients in their own words. So I'm in Psalms of Solomon, chapter 17 and verse 23, and we'll be going through verse 39. In verse 23, it begins, "Behold, O Lord, raise up unto them their king, the son of David, at the time in which you see, O God, that he may reign over Israel, your servant, and gird him with strength, that he may shatter unrighteous rulers, and that he may purge Jerusalem from the nations that trample her down to destruction. Wisely, righteously, he thrust out the sinners from the inheritance. He shall destroy the pride of the sinner as a potter's vessel, and with a rod of iron he shall break in pieces all their substance. He shall destroy the godless nations with the word of his mouth. At his rebuke nations shall flee before him, and he shall reprove sinners for the thoughts of their heart." So here we see the picture of the hope for Messiah who will defeat the nations, who will be a powerful ruler, who will dismiss them and crush them and establish and lay the framework for the reestablishment of righteousness in Israel. The text continues in verse 28. And he shall gather together a holy people, whom he shall lead in righteousness, and he shall judge the tribes of the people that has been sanctified by the Lord his God. He shall not suffer unrighteousness to lodge any more in their midst, nor shall thou dwell with them any man that knows wickedness. For he shall know them that they are all sons of their God, and shall divide them according to their tribes upon the land. And neither sojourner nor alien shall sojourn with them any more. He shall judge peoples and nations in the wisdom of his righteousness. This second portion of the hymn that gives the messianic hope from a military perspective not only sees the Messiah conquering the nations, but also establishing righteousness within Jerusalem and producing an environment in which righteousness can flourish within Jerusalem. And so the text goes on. And he shall have the heathen nations to serve him under his yoke. He shall glorify God in a place to be seen of all the earth. He shall purge Jerusalem, making it holy as of old, so that the nations shall come from the ends of the earth to see his glory, bringing as gifts her sons who had fainted, and to see the glory of the Lord, within which God had glorified her. And he shall be a righteous king, taught of God over them, and there shall be no unrighteousness in his days in their midst, for they shall be holy, and their king anointed of the Lord. He shall not put his trust in horse and rider and bow, nor shall he multiply for himself gold and silver for war, nor shall he gather confidence from a multitude for the day of battle. The Lord himself is his king, the hope of him that is mighty through his hope in God. All nations shall be in fear before him, and he will smite the earth with the word of his mouth forever. And the text goes on. And the point here is that the Messiah is a place where righteousness is established. The nations are expelled from the land. The people themselves of Israel become righteous, and the nations begin to flock to Israel, to this oasis of righteousness that the Messiah creates. And the picture is of a golden age that the Messiah is responsible for. This was the hope that beat in the hearts of many pious Jews in the time after Rome took over Jerusalem in 63 BC. This is the heart that beat in the heart. This is the heart that beat within Israel as Jesus was born and as his mission came forward. And this is why when Jesus is thought perhaps to be a king, that some thought that what he would do would come and wipe out Rome. Jesus did come to be the Messiah. That's what the New Testament is trying to affirm. But he didn't do it in such a way that he was going to deal with the political realities of Rome. He was going to do it in a far more profound way, in a way that dealt with human hearts.